Good evening. It's Friday, September 4th. The White House frantically trying to fight off reports that President Trump expressed contempt for the men and women of the American military, especially those fallen or captured in battle, as losers and suckers.
Now, there's nobody that considers the military, and especially people that have given their lives in the military, to me, they're heroes. To me, they're heroes. It's even hard to believe how they could do it. And I say that. It's so the level of bravery. And to me, they are absolute heroes.
The charges come from the Atlantic Monthly magazine. The story is corroborated by at least two other media outlets, and Trump's already been on record as demeaning the late Senator John McCain, former President Herbert Walker Bush as losers for being shot down in their warplanes. Voting to re-elect or replace President Trump with Joe Biden gets underway today in North Carolina with mail-in voting. Federal agents shoot to death a man suspected of killing a far-right supporter of President Trump last week in Portland after finding him in a suburb of Olympia, Washington. Federal authorities arrest two armed members of the Missouri militia after they bring firearms to a Trump rally in Kenosha, Wisconsin this week. A new projection that the United States, which leads the world in deaths from coronavirus, will surpass 400,000 fatalities by the end of the year. And warnings for Californians for this Labor Day weekend. An extreme heat wave may bring more rotating power blackouts and more coronavirus cases unless people mask up for their holiday activities. From Pacifica Radio, KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, this is the Evening News. I'm Mark Miracle. Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden declared President Donald Trump unfit for the presidency today, delivering an impassioned reaction to a report that Trump, who dodged the draft during the Vietnam War and never served in uniform, allegedly mocked American war dead. The president and his allies have dismissed the report in the Atlantic magazine as false. The allegations, sourced anonymously, describe multiple offensive comments by the president toward fallen and captured U.S. service members, including calling World War I dead at an American military cemetery in France losers and suckers back in 2018. The reported comments, many of which were confirmed independently by the Associated Press, are shining a fresh light on Trump's previous public disparagement of American troops and military families. KPFA's Kate Eder reports.
An article published in The Atlantic this week alleges that President Donald Trump called American soldiers who died in World War I, quote-unquote, losers and quote-unquote, suckers. In a speech today, Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden responded passionately to the report.
If what is written in The Atlantic is true, it's disgusting. And it affirms that Donald Trump is not fit to do the job of president, be the commander-in-chief. When my son volunteered and joined the United States military as the Attorney General and went to Iraq for a year, he wasn't a sucker. The servicemen and women he served with, particularly those who did not come home, were not losers. If these statements are true, the president should humbly apologize to every Gold Star mother and father and every Blue Star family that he's denigrated and insulted. Who the heck does he think he is?
Biden's son, Beau, died of cancer in 2015. The Associated Press has independently confirmed many of Trump's comments. Confirmation has also come from the Washington Post. They shine a new light on statements Trump has previously made disparaging American troops and military families, including when he attacked Kaiser Khan and his wife, whose son was killed while fighting in Iraq in 2004. Trump, responding to questions at the White House following the signing of an economic deal between Syria and Kosovo, dismissed the article as false.
Sir, do you need to apologize to service members and veterans?
No, it was a fake story written by a magazine that was probably not going to be around much longer. But it was a totally fake story, and that was confirmed by many people who were actually there. It was a terrible thing that somebody could say the kind of things, and especially to me, because I've done more for the military than almost anybody else.
The controversy over the article comes amid news that the U.S. unemployment rate dropped to a still high 8.4% in August. The Labor Department said that employers added just 1.4 million jobs last month, which is less than the 1.7 million jobs that were added in July. It is the fewest number of jobs added since employers began hiring again in May after coronavirus-related closures. Biden criticized Trump's handling of the economy and the coronavirus pandemic.
Donald Trump may be the only president in modern history to leave office with fewer jobs than when he took office. The report reinforces the worst fears and painful truths. The economic inequities that began before the downturn have only worsened under this failed presidency. Those at the top are seeing things go up, and those in the middle and below are seeing things go down and get worse. It's no surprise, because at root of this is the fact that Trump has mismanaged the COVID crisis. It didn't have to be this bad to begin with if the president just did his job.
Biden says he has been tested once for the coronavirus and plans to continue to be tested regularly during his presidential campaign. Trump, on the other hand, has defied public health guidance on social distancing. He travels regularly to campaign events where his supporters crowd in, mostly without masks. Trump has repeatedly mocked Biden for following public health guidance and wearing a face mask. The U.S. economy has recovered only half of the 22 million jobs that disappeared when the coronavirus pandemic caused widespread shutdowns in the spring. Economists say this is evidence that economic recovery will be slow and uneven. But in a speech at the White House, Trump bragged about the latest unemployment rate.
Our unemployment rate dropped all the way down to 8.4%. It was just announced an hour ago. And that is many, many months ahead of schedule. They said you won't break 10% at least until next year sometime. And we just hit 8.4%, and we're going down rapidly, plus a lot of jobs were produced. I think what's happening is you're going to see tremendous growth in the very near future. We're rounding the curve. We're coming up with vaccines. I think the vaccines are going to be announced very soon.
The presidential election looms ahead in less than 2 months amid the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. In response to a question about Trump's comments to voters in North Carolina that they should vote twice, both by mail and in person, Biden said Trump is trying to confuse voters and distract them from the current economic situation.
I think it's all designed to create so much chaos that no matter what the outcome of the election is, that it's thrown up in the air. It just undermines the legitimacy of our democratic process, and it's dangerous. There's two things he wants us to talk about. Is the election legitimate? And the whole country's up in flames. Everything's burning. Law and order. Because he doesn't want to talk about anything about the job he hasn't done. The more chaos that is sown here, it's going to disincline people to show up. And every time I speak about it, I feel like I'm playing at his game.
Voting twice is a felony in North Carolina and is illegal in every state. Reporting for KPFA Pacifica Radio, I'm Kate Ida.
In the Atlantic article, Defense Department officials speaking anonymously said Trump made some of the comments as he canceled a 2018 visit to a cemetery outside of Paris where U.S. war dead from World War I are buried. National Security Council staff and the Secret Service told Trump that rainy weather made helicopter travel to the cemetery risky, but they could drive there. Trump responded by saying he didn't want to visit the cemetery because it was filled with losers. The Atlantic said he also feared his hair would get messed up. The Atlantic says that in the planning for a military parade 2 years ago, Trump asked his staff not to include wounded veterans who were amputees. Nobody wants to see that, Trump said. Retired Army Major General Paul Eaton denounced Trump on Twitter. Eaton held the dog tags of his father. who was shot down in the Vietnam War, as he made his remarks.
I'm pretty unhappy with you, Mr. Trump. So I'm going to keep this short for your famous short attention span. You have shown disrespect to the military on countless occasions. I am stunned that anybody in the United States military would consider you anything but a loser or a sucker. You're no patriot.
Eaton urged a vote for Joe Biden. The Atlantic also reported Trump said he didn't want to support the August 2018 state funeral of Republican Senator John McCain, who spent years as a Vietnam prisoner of war, because he was a loser. The report says that Trump was angered that flags were flown at half-staff for McCain, saying, "What the F are we doing that for? The guy was an effing loser." The magazine also said Trump referred to former President George H.W. Bush as a loser because he was shot down by the Japanese as a Navy pilot in World War II. Meanwhile, Trump is blocking the Pentagon's plan to shut down the military's independent newspaper, the Stars and Stripes. Trump said he won't allow that to happen on his watch, tweeting that the U.S. will not be cutting funding to the paper, said it will continue to be what he called a wonderful source of information for the military. The Pentagon has ordered the military's independent newspaper, the Stars and Stripes, to cease publication at the end of the month, despite congressional efforts to continue funding the century-old publication. Mail-in balloting in the presidential election began today as North Carolina started sending out more than 600,000 ballots to voters, responding to a massive spike in requests that has played out across the country as voters look for a safer way to cast ballots during the pandemic. The 643,000 ballots requested in the initial wave in North Carolina, more than 16 times the number the state sent out at the same time 4 years ago. The requests come overwhelmingly from Democratic and independent voters. The North Carolina numbers were one more bit of evidence backing up what experts have been predicting for months. Worries about the virus are likely to push tens of millions of voters to vote by mail for the first time, transforming the way the election is conducted and the vote is counted. In 2016, just 1/4 of the electorate cast votes through the mail. This time, election officials expect the majority of voters to do so. While ballots go out in 2 weeks in other battleground states like Minnesota, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, all eyes are on North Carolina as it leads off. Correspondent Lily Bolke files this report.
Trump knows a swing state when he sees one, and so he knows that North Carolina is a state that he needs to win the election.
That's Western Carolina University Professor Chris Cooper. A new North Carolina poll shows Donald Trump and Joe Biden neck and neck in the swing state Trump won by a slim margin. It's the first state to begin voting. Ballots are being sent out today. 2 months from the election, 20 times more ballots than in 2016 have already been requested.
The increase is apparent across all types of voters, but the increase is much greater amongst Democratic voters than Republican voters.
North Carolina's State Board of Elections warned yesterday not to follow President Trump's suggestion that supporters mail their ballots and vote in person to, quote, make sure it counted, unquote. It's a felony to knowingly vote twice. Sylvia Albert with Common Cause's Voting Rights Program believes Trump has something else in mind.
It's clear to me that his goal is to undermine the integrity of the election. But thankfully, we have systems in place that bar that from being able to happen. North Carolina, like every state, has laws in place to ensure that eligible voters can only vote one ballot that counts.
Instead of illegally voting twice, voters can track their ballots on the election board's website. Both Facebook and Twitter flagged Trump's posts promoting double voting. Facebook added new measures to remove or tag posts with fraudulent election information and block new political ads the week before November 3rd. Jessica Gonzalez with Free Press thinks Facebook is missing an opportunity.
It's a blanket ban on political. So they're not going to invest the time that it does take and the money it takes to actually just root out hate and disinformation, which would be the better tactic.
Yesterday, Homeland Security warned that Russian operatives are amplifying false information about mail-in ballots. Gonzalez wants Facebook to do more.
They also need to just flat out ban the use of their event pages for calls to arms, with a particular focus on white supremacists and militia groups. We're just seeing this phenomenon happen again and again.
Rashad Robinson from Color of Change says already marginalized communities are targeted more often.
What we all need to be looking out for is that misinformation and the disinformation that show up on the platforms, all focused on ensuring that the Black vote, the Black voice, and Black energy and power and culture is suppressed.
From Pacifica Network and Public News Service, I'm Lily Bolke. Thanks for listening at pacificanetwork.org and publicnewsservice.org.
You're listening to the evening news on KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, KFCF Fresno, online at kpfa.org. A North Carolina court ruled today that outstanding restitution fees or other court-imposed monetary obligations cannot prevent convicted felons from voting if they've completed all other portions of their sentence. The ruling, which may face appeals, could pave the way for an influx of felons to have their voting rights restored amid the hotly contested races for the presidency and the U.S. Senate in the battleground state. A three-judge panel of Wake County Superior Court, which is considering a challenge to state law governing the restoration of voting rights, declined to settle the lawsuit's arguments that probation, parole, and post-release supervision are also unfair impediments to voting for those who have completed their incarceration. The judges said further proceedings are needed to address those issues. In North Carolina, felons can register to vote again once they complete all aspects of their sentence, which can range from prison time to court fees or restitution. In a 2-1 decision, the judges ruled that a portion of state law requiring felons to pay all monetary obligations before voting again violates the state constitution because it conditions the ability to cast a ballot on one's financial means. A similar battle over enfranchising former felons is underway in the state of Florida. A judge has barred Kanye West from appearing on the November 3rd ballot in Arizona, concluding that a voter who challenged his candidacy has shown he would probably prevail and had established the possibility of an irreparable harm if the rapper's name were to appear on the ballot. The ruling by Judge Scott McCoy said that the voter who challenged West's bid in Arizona established that the relative hardship favor him. His lawyers argued that putting West on the ballot would create confusion for voters. The decision came a day after West's campaign turned in nearly 58,000 nominating signatures, well above the 39,000 needed to appear on the Arizona ballot. Over the last 10 days, more than 120 people living in other states have registered in Arizona as paid signature gatherers for West, who announced his presidential campaign on July 4th. West has already qualified to appear on the ballot in several states, including Arkansas, Idaho, Iowa, Tennessee, and Utah. He did not qualify in Ohio, Montana, West Virginia, Wisconsin, and other states, although he's filed lawsuits challenging some of those decisions. A judge in Virginia ordered West's name removed from ballots in Virginia yesterday, finding that the rapper failed to meet a requirement that 13 people pledged support for his campaign. The judge ruled 11 of the 13 elector oaths submitted by the West campaign were invalid, including some that were obtained by improper, fraudulent, and/or misleading means. Democrats accuse the Republican Party and the Trump campaign of orchestrating the Kanye West campaigns in order to siphon off votes, especially from African Americans, from Joe Biden. A police union leader said today the officers involved in the suffocation death of Daniel Prude in Rochester, New York, were just following their training when they put a hood over his head and pinned him to the ground for 2 minutes before noticing he wasn't breathing. Union President Michael Mazzeo made his first comments in defense of the officers today after the mayor of Rochester suspended 7 officers for their roles in the March death. Mazzeo says the officers were in a difficult position trying to help someone who appeared to have mental illness. He says they didn't intend to harm Prude. Rochester Mayor Lovely Warren says that she was misled for months about the circumstances of Prude's killing.
Mr. Daniel Prude was failed by our police department, our mental health care system, our society, and he was failed by me.
The mayor said she only became aware that Prude's death involved the use of force on August 4th. Initially, she said the police chief portrayed it as a drug overdose. Prude's daughter, Taishiro Prude, said her father needed the help of a mental health specialist, but was treated like an animal. She told CNN the officers involved should be charged with murder.
I would like to see them be fired and charged with murder. There's video footage of these people suffocating my father. My father was murdered by these police officers. There's no reason why they should be on a paid suspension. They should be arrested and they should be tried.
A crowd of protesters demonstrated late into the night outside Rochester's police headquarters. Officers doused some protesters with a chemical spray and repeatedly fired an irritant into the crowd to drive them away from metal barricades that ringed the building. The father of Jacob Blake says his happy-go-lucky son is optimistic for his future, although he remains paralyzed from the waist down after being shot 7 times by a Kenosha, Wisconsin police officer. The elder Blake spoke to the Associated Press today, clearly exhausted. Blake Sr. said the past 2 weeks have been surreal and like a dream. Said he's mentally worn out. He said he's been receiving death threats, which he said he couldn't talk about in detail. Federal prosecutors say 2 Missouri militia members are facing federal firearms charges after traveling to Kenosha with guns and ammunition. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Milwaukee says Michael Carmo and Cody Smith traveled from Hartville, Missouri, to see President Donald Trump's visit on Tuesday after the police shooting of Jacob Blake. They say both men have criminal convictions that make them ineligible to have firearms. FBI agents arrested them at a hotel near Kenosha. The criminal complaint says the agents found an AR-15 style rifle, a shotgun, 2 handguns, ammunition, and other tactical gear. Federal agents killed a man suspected of fatally shooting a supporter of a far-right group in Portland, Oregon last week. The U.S. Marshals Service said that 48-year-old Michael Forrest Reynolds was killed after he showed a firearm and threatened the lives of law enforcement officers. In an exclusive interview that Vice News broadcast with Reynolds yesterday, Reynolds appeared to admit he shot 39-year-old Aaron J. Danielson on Saturday night in Portland.
I felt that my life and other people around me's lives were in danger. And I felt like I had no choice but to do what I did. They want to paint a picture of Antifa having major involvement. A lot of people don't understand what Antifa represents. And if you just look at the basic definition of it, it's just anti-fascist. And I am 100% anti-fascist. I'm not a member of Antifa. I'm not a member of anything. Honestly, I hate to say it, but I see a civil war right around the corner. That shot felt like the beginning of a war.
Oregon Governor Kate Brown and other Democratic leaders yesterday called for an end to violence in Portland. Brown's statement said there's no place for white supremacy or vigilantism in Oregon. All who perpetrate violent crimes must be held equally accountable. Her condemnation of violence was also signed by almost 24 state and local politicians, a host of organizations, including the local NAACP chapter and the city's professional sports teams, the Trailblazers NBA team and the Timbers soccer team and the Thorns women's soccer squad. Protesters returned last night to a law enforcement building that's a frequent site of protests in Portland. Facebook removed a photo illustration showing a Republican congressional candidate in Georgia posing with a rifle next to 3 Democratic House members, saying that it violated the social media platform's policy against inciting violence. The illustration, a montage of 4 photos, was posted by Marjorie Taylor Greene, a candidate who's previously courted controversy with their support of the baseless QAnon conspiracy theory that involves President Trump and her inflammatory remarks about 2 Muslim congresswomen. Greene is favored to win election in a deeply conservative district northwest of Atlanta. She faces Democrat Kevin Van Osdol in the general election. Greene's post featured 4 separate photos that had been combined to show her posing with a rifle next to Democratic Representatives Rashida Tlaib, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Ilhan Omar. The 3, known as the Squad, are often targeted by Republicans. Omar and Tlaib are 2 of the only 3 Muslim members of Congress. Hate America leftists want to take this country down, Greene wrote, later adding, "We need strong conservative Christians to go on the offensive against these socialists who want to rip our country apart." Facebook said the post violated its policy against calling for violence. Omar said the post was generating death threats. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi called on House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy to immediately condemn the threat of violence. A New Hampshire legislator accused of making a Facebook post that advocated burning and looting houses displaying Black Lives Matter signs is being investigated by the state attorney general and facing calls to resign. New Hampshire Representative James Spillane, a Republican, posted recently, quote, "Public service announcement. If you see a BLM sign on a lawn, it's the same as having a porch light on at Halloween. You are free to burn and loot that house." Sean Locke of the Attorney General's Office Civil Rights Unit said his office received complaints about the post. In a letter to House Speaker Steve Shurtleff, Locke wrote that members of the public who support Black Lives Matter movement have expressed fear that they may become targets of violence as the result of Representative Spillane's post. Shurtleff, a Democrat, called for Spillane's immediate resignation. He said the post was inexcusable. Spillane is seeking a 5th term in the state legislature. Earlier this week, President Donald Trump made a false claim that planes loaded with thugs were being sent to towns to take them over. The claim mirrors a viral Facebook post in June from an Idaho man in Emmett who said left-wing Antifa supporters were on a plane to Boise, Idaho. Eric Tegetoff reports.
The Payette County Sheriff's Office had to release a statement saying the post was false. Matt Hildreth, who heads the website ruralorganizing.org, followed the original rumor as it spread online and thought law enforcement and the media had done a good job debunking it.
I thought there's no way that the President of the United States is getting information like this straight from social media.
The original post was shared on Facebook more than 3,000 times. Hildreth says misinformation about Antifa supporters has spread rapidly on Facebook in the past 3 months, especially as a tool to scare people in rural communities. Rumors of protesters in the wake of George Floyd's death have pushed some armed militia groups to stand guard in cities, including Coeur d'Alene. Hildreth says some of these posts seem to be having their desired effects.
It's not a small-town rumor mill. This is actual disinformation geared at inciting violence. I think that's why it's especially concerning in the climate that we're living in today.
Hildreth says groups are likely to ramp up their misinformation campaigns as the election closes in, but he has faith that election officials will ensure secure voting.
Luckily, I think people are looking out for it, and so I think that that's something that I hope we'll be prepared for, and I do have confidence that we will be.
Hildreth says misinformation about COVID-19 spreading on social media also is concerning. He says before sharing posts with others, folks should be especially skeptical, even of positions they would normally agree with, and investigate the source thoroughly. For Public News Service, I'm Eric Tegedoff.
The New York Police Department says it's trying to find a car that drove through a group of Black Lives Matter protesters blocking a street in Times Square. Video posted on social media shows the car jerking through the crowd last night with its horn blaring as demonstrators scream and scramble out of the way. No one appeared to be seriously injured. The New York Police Department said on Twitter that the car was not a police vehicle. You're listening to the Evening News on KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, KFCF Fresno, online at kpfa.org. It's an hour-long newscast airing each night at 6 with a half-hour edition on the weekend. And you can find any of the newscasts, all of them, as a matter of fact, archived online at kpfa.org. I'm Mark Miracle. New projections from a University of Washington institute say the U.S. death toll from COVID-19 is likely to rise to 410,000 by January 1st. The grim new numbers are from the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. Its most likely scenario assumes that individual mask use and other mitigation measures remain unchanged. Its worst-case scenario is for 620,000 deaths. It says that projection is based on mask usage staying at current rates and government continuing to relax social distancing requirements. The best case scenario is for 288,000 deaths by January 1st. That projection is based on nearly everyone wearing a mask and governments imposing social distancing requirements. The Institute projects that India will surpass the United States in total deaths, with the most likely scenario of 660,000 deaths by January 1st in that country. On a per capita basis, the U.S. ranks among the top 10 in terms of deaths from COVID-19. Also on that list, the Netherlands, Spain, Belgium, France, Sweden, Peru, Ecuador, and San Marino. The state of Iowa remains one of the nation's hot spots for COVID-19 outbreaks, but its Republican governor has refused to embrace many of the ways recommended to slow the transmission of the disease. Mike Moen has a story.
A recent White House report recommends mask mandates and other prevention measures for Iowa after seeing alarming coronavirus trends. But Governor Kim Reynolds has long resisted some of those tools. Reynolds has ordered bar closures in certain counties where college students have fueled the surge in cases, but the report suggests many more are needed. Polk County Health Department spokesperson Nola Eigner-Davis says this could be avoided if Iowans practice simple safety measures.
In order to combat COVID-19, we have to follow the mitigation strategies that we know reduces community spread. That is wearing a mask everywhere you go.
The White House report says 28% of Iowa counties have high levels of community transmission, including Polk County. Governor Reynolds has defended her refusal of a statewide mask rule, saying individuals should be trusted to make the right decisions. But local leaders have said not having a unified statewide approach sends mixed messages. And Davis adds, with all the conflicting information, Iowans might be tuning out the very reports and guidelines that are being distributed to help them.
The biggest concern is what we call COVID-19 fatigue, that individuals are just tired of wearing masks, tired of being told where to go and where not to go, tired of just living this new life. And believe it or not, this is our new life.
And with Labor Day weekend here, health officials are advising people to curb any gatherings they'd normally plan so the fall season doesn't see a new spike in coronavirus cases. And if they do congregate, mask wearing, social distancing, and opting to stay home when someone has symptoms or doesn't feel well are strongly recommended. Mike Moen, Public News Service.
California's workplace safety regulator has ordered the dental clinic at San Quentin State Prison to stop many of its operations because of practices it says have contributed to the spread of COVID-19 at the facility. The San Francisco Chronicle says the order from the California Division of Occupational Safety and Health comes in response to an outbreak that has infected more than 2,200 inmates. About two-thirds of the population, 26, have died. The prison is the California lockup hit hardest by the COVID-19 outbreak. Russian scientists have belatedly published first results from early trials into the experimental Sputnik V vaccine, which received government approval last month but drew considerable criticism from experts, as the shots had only been tested on several dozen people before being more widely administered. In a report published in the journal Lancet today, developers of the vaccine said it appeared to be safe and to prompt an antibody response in all 40 people tested in the second phase of the study within 3 weeks. However, the authors noted that participants were only followed for 42 days. The study sample was small, and there was no placebo or control vaccine used. One part of the safety trial included only men. The study mostly involved people in their 20s and 30s, so it's unclear how the vaccine might work in older populations most at risk of the more severe complications of COVID-19. International experts remain cautious over the vaccine's effectiveness and safety. Julia Chapman reports from Moscow.
Russia's Sputnik V vaccine was registered by regulators in August, a move many critics called premature. The Lancet says the two-shot inoculation triggers an immune response to COVID-19, producing antibodies 1.5 times higher than those in patients who have recovered from the virus. It confirms, however, that only 76 people have taken part in clinical trials so far, so it's a very small pool of data.
Julia Chapman, Moscow.
Hong Kong has begun a free universal COVID-19 testing program, despite criticism that it is not effective and could be misused for surveillance. The voluntary mass testing is being conducted with the help of medical staff from mainland China. A health workers union has criticized the efforts as an inefficient waste of resources, while activists have said it could be used to collect DNA samples. Authorities have dismissed the criticism as a smear campaign. Hong Kong has so far managed to keep the virus at a comparatively low level with just under 5,000 confirmed infections. But there are fears that several smaller waves might lead to a larger outbreak, which could then spiral out of control. Reporter Richard Kimba has more from Hong Kong.
The head of infectious diseases at Hong Kong University's medical school says the city needs to complete a full week of mass testing before it's possible to draw real conclusions on the level of asymptomatic COVID-19 transmission in the community. Ivan Hong said at least 1 million tests need to be carried out in order to be able to make educated estimates on the level of spread across the 7.5 million population. So far, 128,000 tests have been done, with 6 positive cases identified. 4 of those were for patients who had previously tested positive and had since been discharged from hospital, but were still found to be carrying traces of the virus. The voluntary mass testing scheme is scheduled to last until Tuesday, but may be extended for another week if there is enough demand. It has faced criticism from some health experts of being an ineffective exercise and a waste of resources. Richard Kimber in Hong Kong.
The official U.S. unemployment rate fell sharply in August to 8.4% from 10.2%, even as hiring slowed in August and employers added the fewest jobs since the pandemic began. Employers added 1.4 million jobs. That was down from 1.7 million in July. The U.S. economy has recovered about half of the 22 million jobs lost to the pandemic. Most economists say a meaningful economic recovery will likely be impossible until the coronavirus is brought under some control. The ongoing job losses and economic slump have left a rising share of job seekers out of work for longer periods. From June to July, the number of people who were unemployed for 15 weeks or longer tripled to more than 6 million. Many tenants hit hard by the novel coronavirus are breathing a sigh of relief since the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention announced a new moratorium on evictions until the end of the year. But the new order has some important terms renters need to be aware of. Diane Bernard reports.
Attorney Matt Hill at the Public Justice Center in Baltimore says to qualify, renters need to make less than $99,000 a year and meet several other requirements. They must prove they've lost income due to the pandemic, that they've applied for government assistance to pay rent, and that they could become homeless if kicked out. He notes that savvy landlords could dispute small details.
So it's going to help millions of tenants, and it's incredibly important, but it does require tenants to be vigilant and to take action. Because if the landlord is trying to use some sort of loophole or make some sort of argument, they are going to need to respond.
Almost 300,000 households unable to pay rent are at risk of eviction in Maryland, according to one estimate. For assistance in qualifying, contact the Fair Housing Action Center of Maryland. While he thinks the moratorium is a critical first step to protect families, he's also urging lawmakers to take more permanent steps to relieve economic hardships created by the pandemic.
If this order is not paired with rent relief, so rental assistance, canceling the rent, something that addresses the long-term structural problem of the lack of income that's related to COVID-19, then we are going to be just kicking the can down the road.
People who violate the terms of the eviction moratorium face harsh penalties, including up to a $100,000 fine and a year in jail. And if a tenant lies about any of the 5 requirements, they could be charged with perjury, which carries a penalty of up to 5 years in prison. For Public News Service, I'm Diane Bernard.
Concerns are growing about possible fraud at EDD, California's unemployment agency. Numerous reports have emerged of people receiving unsolicited letters, some containing debit cards from the agency in their mailboxes. Last week, California had processed more than 405,000 pandemic unemployment assistance claims, and it accounts for more than half of all the claims filed in the country. EDD has paid nearly $77 billion in unemployment benefits since the start of the pandemic, processing nearly 12 million claims. David Robertson said his son applied for unemployment benefits at the end of April. He got a letter in August saying he was entitled to $167 a week, but when they called the agency to ask more questions, they found that the contact information on his son's account had been changed and more than $14,000 in benefits had been issued to someone else. California's auditor last month said EDD was at high risk for waste and fraud, citing the large number of claims that overwhelmed the agency. You're listening to the Evening News on KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, KFCF Fresno. Online, kpfa.org.
Hey everyone, this is Brian Edwards-Teekert.
And I'm Kat Brooks.
Weekday mornings we host Upfront.
2 hours of conversation about what's in the news and what should be.
Politics, technology.
Prisons, police.
What's happening in City Hall and at the State House.
In Washington and in the streets.
That's starting at 7 a.m., right after Democracy Now!
On Upfront.
The first and only Native American to serve in the California legislature won unanimous approval for his bill to speed the process of repatriating Native American remains and artifacts to tribes. They're currently held by the University of California and other state institutions. The measure is awaiting California Governor Gavin Newsom's signature. Emma Herdman reports.
Assemblymember James Ramos of Highland in Southern California is a Serrano Cahuilla tribal member and the first Native American elected to state legislature in California. He says that his bill, Assembly Bill 275, will quicken the process of returning ancestral remains to California Native Americans so that they can be buried with the respect and devotion that they deserve.
There exists a significant lack of tribal knowledge in the process of identifying which human remains or cultural items that should be repatriated back to tribes for reburial. To address this issue, this bill updates current law with respect to the possession of human remains by requiring tribal traditional knowledge to be factored in the repatriation process and starts to move forward to acknowledge California's first people.
Although federal and state lawmakers passed legislation to allow Native Americans the right of repatriation decades ago, hundreds of thousands of remains, like bones and artifacts, are still being held by state institutions like the UC, University of California. In 1990, federal lawmakers passed NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And in 2001, California lawmakers passed CalNAGPRA. The laws allow institutions flexibility in how they carry out repatriation. UCLA has repatriated nearly all of the remains and artifacts in its collection, while UC Berkeley has returned only about 20%. Ramos says that AB 275 would revise the process of creating inventories of indigenous remains and artifacts and require California Indian tribes be consulted during the creation of those inventories. It also loosens the process by which a direct descendant or California Indian tribe can request the return of human remains or cultural items, allowing unrecognized tribes to do so. Many California tribes lost federal recognition in the 1900s as part of the federal government's efforts to integrate Native Americans into American society. Again, Ramos.
So looking at the issues that are facing California Indian people, there's federally recognized tribes in the state of California. However, there's also California Indian people that during the history of the state of California have been left out of the discussion. Those tribal people, ancestral territories from throughout the state of California, Los Angeles, San Francisco, that's ancestral territory of Indian people.
AB 275 revises various definitions, including the definition of, quote, a California Indian tribe, unquote, to include both a tribe that meets the federal definition of an Indian tribe and non-federally recognized tribes who are located in California and are on the Native American Heritage Commission's list. Governor Gavin Newsom has until September 30th to decide whether or not to sign the legislation. I'm Emma Herdman for KPFA News.
California lawmakers have voted to exempt about 24 more professions from a landmark labor law designed to treat more people like employees instead of contractors. Among other things, the new legislation would end what critics have said were unworkable limits on services provided by freelance still photographers, photojournalists, freelance writers, editors, and newspaper cartoonists. The bill has certain restrictions to make sure they're not replacing current employees. Lawmakers separately approved giving newspapers another year before they have to start treating newspaper carriers as employees. It would add further exemptions for musicians with single engagement live performances, those involved with sound recordings or musical compositions, insurance inspectors, real estate appraisers and inspectors, manufactured housing salespeople, youth sports coaches, people engaged by International Exchange Visitor Program, and competition judges. The law, AB 5, that took effect this year was primarily aimed at Uber and Lyft. They're the sponsors of a more than $100 million campaign to pass a November ballot measure to overturn AB 5, the landmark gig workers legislation. One of the bills that died as time ran out on the state legislature this week, the California Circular Economic Plastic Pollution Reduction Act. KPFA's Daniel Whitty reports.
The Plastic Pollution Reduction Act would have required businesses to reduce the use of single-use plastics in packaging and foodware by as much as 75%. Single-use plastic use has increased due to the COVID-19 pandemic as more people are eating more takeout. The bills, one in the State House and one in the State Assembly, would have required businesses to reduce plastic use by 2032. Advocates say the legislation is well written. It targets plastic only and is enforceable with fines. Democrat Lorena Gonzalez from San Diego is the author of the legislation in the Assembly.
The current pandemic has only increased our awareness of single-use plastic like utensils, bags, and containers of all of our favorite takeouts. No one is saying that these items don't have a use, but we are not being honest with ourselves about their end of life, and it is past time to do something about it. Without comprehensive reform, we will continue to throw our single-use plastics into the recycling bin to be sorted and baled, but they will only end up in the landfill or incinerated. That's why this bill would take a comprehensive approach to reduce waste from single-use plastic packaging and specified products 75% by 2032 through source reduction, recycling, and composting, and require these items be fully recyclable or compostable by 2032.
Gonzalez says her bill would also grow the recycling industry, which would create more jobs. Part of the bill's language encourages producers to do in-state manufacturing. San Francisco Assemblyman Phil Ting is also a co-author of the Plastic Pollution Reduction Act. He says that only 9% of plastic is actually recycled.
Because right now, all those takeout containers that we say, oh, this is plastic, we think we can go recycle it, doesn't get recycled. It used to go to China because China was buying our plastic. But China a couple of years ago said, you know what, we got enough plastic here and from other parts of the world, we're not buying your plastic anymore. So you know where it's going? It's going into the landfills. It's not going and being recycled at some recycling plant in the sky.
The University of California recently committed to eliminate single-use plastics on its campuses over the next decade. Lawmakers say they will reintroduce the legislation in the next session. For KPFA News, I'm Daniel Whitty.
California is on the verge of phasing out its state-operated juvenile prison system. The move is hailed by reform advocates, criticized by counties that would assume responsibility for the youth. The bill generally follows Governor Gavin Newsom's latest plan to unravel the Division of Juvenile Justice, which houses about 750 youths. But legislators added what advocates said are needed safeguards and standards for the hundreds of millions of dollars that would eventually flow to counties to house and treat the youths. Counties say those restrictions hobble their ability to provide proper care. The legislation was passed just before the legislature ended its session this week. It's now before Governor Newsom for his signature or his veto. Two former Indian residential schools in Canada have been designated National Historic Sites. The schools represent a dark period in Canada's relationship with its Indigenous people. Dan Karpinchuk reports.
The two schools added to the official roster of National Historic Events are in Nova Scotia and in Manitoba. It's the first time a residential school has been named in such a way. Canada's Environment Minister Jonathan Wilkinson says telling history is not just about telling the good things, it's also about recalling the more challenging aspects, commemorating and understanding history, not celebrating it. Perry Bellegarde is the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. Bellegarde says First Nations people still feel today the intergenerational trauma of the residential schools.
And it's part of our shared history, and it's a dark history in terms of our shared history, but Canada and everybody needs to learn from that. And again, we've always said that those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it.
The residential schools are described as a dark stain on Canada's past. The government-funded, church-run schools were designed to assimilate Native children into white culture. Thousands were physically, sexually, and emotionally abused at the schools, which operated from the mid-1800s for more than a century. For National Native News, I'm Dan Karpinchuk.
Paul Rusesabagina, the Hotel Rwanda film hero who was arrested early this week to face terror, murder, and arson charges, says he's choosing his defense team to prove his innocence. In an exclusive interview with the East African newspaper, Rusesabagina said from his police cell that he has so far been treated with kindness and expects to receive justice and a fair trial in Rwanda. He told the paper he has been treated with kindness, has the medication he needs to treat his blood pressure and cardiovascular conditions, and was visited by two doctors yesterday. He declined to discuss details concerning how he was arrested and how he wound up in Rwanda. Following his arrest, Rusesabagina, whose heroic actions during the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi inspired the Hollywood movie Hotel Rwanda, was paraded before the media by Rwanda authorities last Monday. His deeds are also captured in the 1998 book, We Wish to Inform You That Tomorrow We Will Be Killed with Our Families, by the American journalist and author Philip Gorovich. It remains unclear how he ended up on Rwandan soil, where he had not set foot in almost 20 years. Authorities said he was arrested on an international warrant and with the cooperation of other countries. He's accused of founding and sponsoring an armed rebellion that claimed multiple attacks on Rwandan territory, leading to deaths and destruction of property. While living in Belgium and the United States with his family, he formed the Rwandan Movement for Democratic Change in 2018, an opposition party with a military wing, the National Liberation Front, that has claimed responsibility for a spate of attacks in Rwanda. From its base in the eastern DRC, he's also been a fierce critic of President Paul Kagame since the early 2000s, often accusing the government of undermining human rights. Kagame has won praise for the economic development and stability that his country's experienced since the 1994 genocide, in which 800,000 people were killed. The 62-year-old has also spearheaded gender equality and dramatically boosted literacy in Rwanda. But Kagame, who's been president since 2000 and won his most recent election in 2017 with 99% of the vote, is also accused of authoritarianism and extreme intolerance of any critical voices, threats to his political dominance. The Rwandan government has also repeatedly been accused of targeting dissidents overseas. South Korea's top medical body faced a rift today after trainee doctors rejected a deal by its leaders to end a 2-week strike, although the government backed down from reform plans aimed at averting future epidemics. Some of the trainees vowed to continue the walkout by about 16,000 interns and resident doctors to oppose the government measures such as increasing the number of doctors and building public medical schools, among others. The strike has hindered efforts to damp down a new wave of coronavirus infections. Bruce Harrison reports from Seoul, South Korea.
South Korean Prime Minister Jung Se-kyun says the government, ruling party, and Korean Medical Association reached a dramatic compromise after talks that lasted all night. Roughly 16,000 resident doctors and interns have been on strike. The Prime Minister says the strike had hindered efforts to slow the spread of a new wave of coronavirus infections. The doctors are against government reforms that would increase the number of doctors and create public medical schools. The government says its efforts would increase medical care nationwide to deal with crises like COVID-19. But the doctors argue it would saturate the workforce, cutting into pay without improving working conditions in rural parts of the country where doctors are greatly needed. Bruce Harrison, Seoul.
The operator of the state's power grid is calling on Californians to conserve electricity as the state faces dangerously high temperatures through the Labor Day weekend. Temperatures are expected to be 10 to 25 degrees above normal, many areas seeing triple-digit highs. The agency that runs California's power grid has issued a flex alert for afternoon and evening hours Saturday through Monday, asking people to conserve power. The California Independent System Operator also ordered power generators to postpone routine maintenance and restore any out-of-service transmission lines. Governor Newsom declared a state of emergency last night, suspending certain pollution regulations to permit permit requirements for power plants. The heat wave is also expected to bring another challenge to thousands of firefighters who are making progress on numerous wildfires, including 3 massive blazes in the Bay Area. Partly cloudy skies tomorrow in the San Francisco Bay Area with highs in the mid-70s around the Bay. Inland, sunny with highs in the triple digits. Sunny in the central San Joaquin Valley tomorrow with a high of 106 degrees. 103 is the forecast high in Los Angeles under sunny skies. Good evening.
Community announcement for September 2020. Yoga and Qigong instructor Manny Barini continues to offer a free 1-hour workshop via Zoom every Saturday. These workshops are designed to de-stress as well as boost and balance the immune system. The Spanish language workshop is at 11 a.m. The English language workshop is at 3 p.m. The Zoom link is posted on her site at ameliabarili.com. She also has health information on her YouTube channel, The New Paradigms. This community announcement is produced by the First Voice Apprenticeship Program. Please send your event for consideration to calendar@kpfa.org. To hear this announcement again, call 510-848-6767, extension 629, or view it online at kpfa.org.